Hey, this is Omero, and this is another episode of the new video series I'm coming out with. It'll probably be called Omero's Journey or something along those lines. It's not up for discussion, but that's what I'll just call it for now. So in this video, I want to talk about how the whole observant, intuition, detective part of me came to be. And for that, I'm going to start with the backstory. So I'll probably have two parts to this. One video is just explaining the backstory so that it's easier to understand how everything came about. And then the second part to it will just be what it's like right now. Like what I think, the way I think right now. Or the way the observant, detective, intuition, deduction side applies to me right now. So if you're not that interested in the backstory, then make sure to check out the other video, which is more direct and to the point of how I think right now. And I think it'll be more interesting. But yeah, let's get started with the backstory. So I'll start when me and my family moved to Canada. That's where everything sort of got started in the first place. And I feel like explaining the backstory will help you understand how everything kind of formed. We came to Canada twice, or we tried to move to Canada twice. Once when for 5th grade, and I'll just call it 5th grade because here we call them grade 5, but I think most people call it by the numbers, so I'll just call it 5th grade. But we came here once for 5th grade, and then after about 9 months, we went back to Ecuador for another 9 or so months, and then we came back to Canada for 6th grade. And it was the second time where things really changed, or where I really changed. Things changed like from the first time we came, but it was the second time when I really started to think differently. Back in Ecuador, I used to be like this very extroverted, outgoing, involved in every sort of activity type of kid. And back then, obviously, it was like back when we were 10 years old. So you might not think a lot of this has a lot of weight, but that's kind of how it was back then. The school had an hour, it was like an hour and 20 minutes, something like that, set aside just for practice time. Or I don't know how long it was, but we had about an hour just to practice a team sport or activity like an art. And for me, I practiced soccer and basketball. Soccer was Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and then basketball was Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I practiced, so it was basically, right, it was like 5 days of the week that you had to practice with the team, for the school team. It wasn't like a regular whatever practice, it was like the actual school team. So you obviously had to be good enough in the first place. And then on the weekends we'd have like the weekend tournament games, the weekend league games. And so it was basically almost every day that I was involved in these activities. And like I said, I was also like super outgoing and everything, so like I got along with people, which I feel like I still get along with people, but back then I was really out there, like sort of some sort of center of attention, you know. I wasn't like a class clown, you know, like I think I was still funny back then, I don't remember, but people like still got along with me and everything. I got along with people pretty easily. I had good grades, everything. Like everything was like lined up perfectly. We went to a lot of like kid parties or hangouts with friends at their place or at my place. Like a lot of that sort of thing happened back then. And then when we came to Canada, it all sort of changed, obviously. But the main thing that changed was that I started to be more mindful and thoughtful of things. The best way I can explain it is, if my parents, before coming or before us moving, were this very nicely sealed bottle, where they had like a good design, a good sticker and everything. It and the bottle was sealed and everything. When we came to Canada, it sort of changed in that some of the liquid inside of the bottle started leaking, and it was kind of like they had to try and slowly clean up the stickers or the outside of the bottle. And basically there were some topics that like were raised that me and my brother had never heard about before or never had to really care about, right? Like I came here with my father, my mother, and my brother. But for the first few months where we came here, we had to move in here with one of my mother's relatives, with one of her cousins, because we obviously, like, it'd be easier if we could have a place to stay until we found our own. So we stayed there for like a few months, and until we found our own place. And obviously, like, finding your own place without, like, when the first time moving to Canada is kind of difficult, because they ask you for all these things, like, where have you worked, like, where are you working, where are you doing, like, all these things. And if you just recently moved, then you don't have a lot to go off of. But basically a lot of ideas or topics about money or place to stay or food or all these things started being brought up, you know. And obviously, naturally, like, my parents tried to not change so much how our lives were from Ecuador. They wanted the best for us, like most of them do. But it was sort of like they tried to stop the leaking of the liquid from the bottle and, like, make it all nice. But some of these things, me and my brother obviously noticed and paid attention to. And obviously this is just a part of growing up that everyone has to go through at some point. And it's not like I had it rough or anything, because I didn't. But the point is that I started to be more concerned with and more mindful about the money being spent. Because obviously back then, like, you're 10 years old, so you rely, like, completely on your parents. So I started being more mindful of money. And some examples I could give of what it was like is, for example, when my parents would want to get me new clothes or a new school bag or a new cell phone, or if they want me to participate in, like, a house league or some summer camp activity, stuff like that. I was always worried and concerned about the money being spent, and I thought, if it isn't necessary, or if I don't really need it, then maybe the money can be spent better somewhere else or after a certain period of time. Like, maybe we can wait and spend this money at another time in a better way. And that's sort of what were the things I started thinking, which obviously nowadays, like, I think some of those things did sort of help a little, like shoes or frequently buying clothes. Those sort of things I think kind of helped. But things like a new phone or house league or summer activities, like, obviously now I realize that those things sometimes can be paid, like, over a period of time, and even if they can't, like, they're always worth the time and they're always worth the money. And it got to the point where anytime, like, my parents would want to get me new stuff, I would generally just say no. Or to do an activity, I would generally just say no or try and wait it out, to the point where they'd have to kind of, like, pull me out and be like, okay, like, you've worn, like, the same pair of shoes for this long and this and that, and, like, they'd kind of, like, pull me out because I started to actually need these things, you know, like, my bag is, like, has, you know, like, it's really worn out. or like it's somewhat, for some, like some of the part of the bag is like broken inside, or it has like a hole or something. It's not like it was unusable or anything, but it was just like it was starting to get worn out, and I needed new ones. And so I kind of got to that point, and all these new topics that were being brought up about like places to stay and money and jobs and all these things and time, I guess, they combined with me being kind of exhausted coming from Ecuador, from practicing all those sports and doing all these activities all the time. And so, for example, during recess, a lot of times I would rather just watch people play the game. Like, I'd rather just watch people play soccer from the sidelines than actually play it. And even when I did play it, I didn't give it like my 110% like I used to. And there's this thing that's kind of difficult to explain unless you've, or kind of probably difficult to understand unless you've actually lived it, where you've mastered something to like a really good level, or you've gotten to the really decent level, or you're far above everyone else, or not far above, but you're like decently far above all your other classmates or all your peers in whatever art or music or sport, whatever it may be, right? Like if you play guitar and you've mastered it or whatever, there's this sort of thing about it where once you've given it your 110% for like a long period of time, once something changes or shakes that up, it's kind of nice to just sit back and watch somebody else play, even if it's not at the same level, even if it's at a much lower level. You get some sort of fulfillment or enjoyment out of it. And that's kind of what I felt. I think at the start, like when we first, the first 9 months when we came, before coming the second time to Canada, the first time I did give it like my 110%, and I didn't have all these things in mind too much. But the second time is when things really started to change, and I didn't give it like my 110% as much when playing or doing activities. There was only one kid who was really good, like everyone else aside from that kid was worse than my classmates back in Ecuador that played soccer. And I don't know where I'd put this kid. His name was Justin. He was a really close friend. But I don't know where I'd put him on the scale compared to my friends in Ecuador. But like something about it, I couldn't quite put it. Like I couldn't quite put him on the scale versus them. But he was good. He was definitely good. Like recognizable, outstandingly good, But aside from him, there wasn't anyone else that stood out. And so for like, at first, obviously, I tried my best, but later on, I sort of stopped caring about it too much. And I started being more laid back, and I didn't really care to put that much effort into the game anymore. My brother's a year older than me, and he kind of followed along better with what my parents, with the way they were trying to like clean up how the liquid was spreading onto the sticker of the bottle. And so he didn't really turn out like me. But I just kind of started being more mindful of things. And it really changed a lot from around ages 13 to 16 or 13 to 17. When I turned 13, which was the next school year, it was like 7th grade, right? That's when I got a PS3. And what we used to do before, or what I used to do before for free time, was probably just watch TV and then sometimes go on the computer and play browser games or Facebook games or RuneScape, that sort of thing. Or I would just sit and watch anime. maybe YouTube, but back then I don't think it was like there was that, like YouTube was that big. I mean, it was like 2010 or 2011, but YouTube was always around. But nowadays there's a lot more content on it, and you can stay there for hours. But back then I think there was less of that, right? Because there were less videos. So I think I mostly just watched anime and watched TV or played browser games. And then on the weekends, we'd be allowed to play video games. But when we got the PS3, that sort of changed because everyone was allowed to play on the weekends, like all my friends. And so obviously when I brought that up, we started being allowed to play on weekdays. And this is where I started to get this sort of corrupted or twisted set of ideals or standards or morals and beliefs of what life was like. Like I said, this was from ages like 13 to 17. I started to think that a lot of things were sort of unnecessary in life, or that there wasn't a point to doing them. Like I would think, what's the point of doing this? Like, why is this necessary? This is so unnecessary. That's what I would think about a lot of things. For example, things like doing exercise or activities, or a lot of things with going outside. It's difficult to think about exact examples that I had, but just in general, I started to think that a lot of things were pointless or unnecessary. I guess a good example is back then, even though we were just kids or like teens, like around when I was 13, 14, like for example, there were a couple of opportunities where like I could have like hung out closer with a girl, you know? But like close, even though we were like young, obviously it wasn't super serious or meaningful, but it was still like doing things with girls, like one-on-one type thing. Like I'm not saying like specifically doing an event, but I'm just saying like, you know, being like teen boyfriend and girlfriend or teen dating, that type of thing, that type of idea. But the way I thought about it back then was like, what's the point of this? What's the point of putting my time into this? It's not like we're gonna get married, or like we're probably not gonna get married. So like, what's the point? And I thought that it was just like unnecessary, meaningless, pointless, that sort of thing. And I guess another example I could give of is doing exercise and activities. One thing I would think is, for example, I would look at my parents or other people's parents, like basically 99%, 95% of the parents, and I would be like, they're not really fit. What's the point of doing exercise or activities for all these years if at the end of the day, when I grow older and when I work, I'm not going to be doing any of it and I'm not going to be fit? What's the point of spending all this time right now doing it if at the end of the day I'm just going to be not doing anything? And that's sort of like the corrupted, twisted mentality and standards I started to have. And it was only really around ages 17 to 19 where my world kind of started like opening up more, and I started to question a lot of things. But before then, it was even things like talking. Like even if it was like I was walking down the bus and I saw a friend, especially if it was a girl, like nowadays obviously I regret it, but I think to myself like, why would I bother talking to them? Like what's the point of talking to them if I could just like, I would have something in my mind about YouTube or the game or school or something, and I would be like, I'd rather spend my time thinking about this and being inside my head rather than talking to this person. Even though nowadays I obviously like regret it. But that's the kind of mentality I had. I was in my head a lot back then. And it was to the point where I was like, I kind of like became philosophical, like too philosophical. And that's what kind of gave me those like twisted, corrupted ideas of things being unnecessary or pointless. But I like strongly convinced myself that those things were pointless and meaningless. And so all these things I did less of, and I talked less and did all these things less. But everything started opening up when, like, around the ages of 17 to 19, when it felt like I started being challenged more about whether those things were really unnecessary or pointless or meaningless like I thought they were, or like I was trying to convince myself that they were. My brother's a year older than me, but he's like 2 grades up because of when his birthday is. He's like a year and 2 months older than me, and his birthday's in November and mine's in January. So in terms of school grades, he's 2 years older than me, but in terms of like actual age, he's like a year and 2 months older than me. But it was around this time, I think, that he started to go to university. And obviously, like, I started being more by myself. And it was kind of like life was starting to give me a little nudge, like try and expose me to more ideas and try and challenge me. And so this is when I started to change a little. I started to question a lot more what I was doing. Or not what I was doing, but I started to question more whether those things were really unnecessary. And it would be anything, you know, things like activities, exercises, sports, hanging out with friends, girls, like all these things sort of started to weigh more inside me. And maybe it's like the happiness that came out of them or something, but it felt like something was sort of missing for me. And it didn't seem right to just discard some of these things as being useless or pointless. So I just started to like pay more attention to them. And I started to think less that they were unnecessary and all these things and pointless. And I started to think more as if I was kind of wrong back then. And even though I don't do or participate in some of the activities, like, there is a point to them, or like they are, some of these things are necessary, and some of these things are like good things to have. Another example of something I just thought of that was unnecessary is, for example, answering questions in class or letting people know you know the answer to something. Things like these. For example, for math, like, I was like pretty smart, like decently smart. And up until we did like Calc 1, Calc 2 in like the last year and a half of high school, up until then, like, I knew most of the answers, or I tried to figure out most of the things inside the class. But even if I knew the answer, or if I came up with an answer to a question, I would think like, what's the point of letting everyone else know that I know the answer? Like, it's good enough for me to know that I know the answer, but I'm not gonna raise my hand and answer the question, you know? Not to say that I knew every answer, because I didn't, but a lot of them, like, I would come up with a solution in my head and I would have the answer for. But I wouldn't really want to raise my hand and say the answer, even though like everyone else's first instinct is like, you either work out the problem or not. And if you do work out the problem, then you might as well raise your hand and say what the answer is, right? But for me, it wasn't like that. A lot of times I would work out the problem, but I just wouldn't raise my hand and answer. And that would be like 90% of things, like 90% of things I would like work them out, but I would never raise my hand. I rarely did. And because of that as well, like, I started doing a lot of calculations and tricks in my head. And a lot of things I felt like I was discovering or learning were kind of useful, and a lot of them were just in math. things with patterns or calculations, I like those sort of things. Obviously, if it isn't obvious enough, like I like math, like in general, in the first place. But a lot of like calculation tricks are things I started figuring out by myself. And calculations in particular, like I started doing those all the time. No matter the number, like I would always try and do them. Or if I didn't know how to solve a problem, like the strategy to solving a problem, sometimes I'd try and sort of brute force it by trying to meet the problem from like two different ends. And I guess I might make a different video on this because I feel like some of this is useful, but some of the calculation tricks, for example, were things like multiplying. For example, like multiplying by 9. How do you multiply a number by 9? And what I came up with is you can multiply the number by 10, and then you take away from the answer, you take away one quantity of the number that you're multiplying by 10. So for example, if we do like, I don't know, it could be any big number, but just so that it's easy to explain and easy to understand for you guys, if it's a number like 32, you'd be like, oh, what's 32 times 9? Well, you can just do 32 times 10, which is you add a 0, 320, 320. And then you take away 32 from that answer. So 320 minus 32, that's like 290. I haven't done math in a long time, okay, but it's like 288, right? I think that's the answer, yeah. 288. So 32 times 9 is 288. And you just do that quickly in your head. And so like for every time you see like a calculation by 9, no matter how big the number is, it's pretty simple, right? And most people just find the techniques like only for things like multiplying by 10, but you don't realize like there's so many techniques for multiplying by different numbers. And so that would be one of those techniques, multiplying by 9. So say like 363 multiplied by 9. Well, it's 3630, and then you take away 363 from the answer. And then you kind of try and do that in your head. 363. And it's like 3... I haven't done math in like a long time, so I'm really rusty, but it's like 33 something, or like 329 something. Something like that, right? Obviously it's 4 digits, but yeah. It's something like that. It's like 3,200 and something. 290 something. Something around there. Or yeah, something around that. Or like another example would be multiplying by 5. How do I multiply by 5? Well, you can just multiply the number by 10, and then you take half of that. So what's 32 times 5? Well, 32 times 10 is 320. So half of that is 160. So 32 times 5 is 160. And obviously there's different techniques. There's a lot of different techniques and things, you know, that I kind of learned or figure out. And it wasn't just multiplication or division. It was all sorts of things, all sorts of patterns and algebra things, all sorts of things, right? Or for example, multiplying a number by a number that is more than one digit, you can like break it up into parts. So say, what is 32 times 15? Well, you can do 32 times 10, and then you do 32 times 5, and then you add those two things, because 5 plus 10 is 15. So if you multiply them separately, like if you divide 15 into two different numbers, and then multiply each separate part by the 32, and then you add those two results together, then you can get the result for 32 times 15, right? So 320 plus 160, that's 480, right? So 32 times 15 is 480, that sort of thing. Or for example, division. For division, you can, some divisions, once you get to decimals, it's the same thing as multiplying by the inverted number. So for example, 0.25 we all know is decimal that is equivalent to 1/4, right? A quarter. 0.25 is the same thing as 1 over 4. So if you divide something by 0.25, it's the same as multiplying it by 4. So say you're dividing 5 by 0.25, well, you can just multiply it by 4 and it's the same thing. Because the inverted, like if you take the fraction and put it upside down, it's the same thing as multiplying it by that fraction. So instead of doing 5 divided by 1 over 4, you do 5 times 4 over 1. And it would give you the same result. And so it's those sort of ideas and strategies that I learned a lot because I learned a lot back then. And I know I kind of went on a tangent, and like a long tangent, but and most of you probably skipped that part, but yeah. These are the sort of things I had in my head back then. But around 17 to 19, like I was saying, I started to question a lot of these things. I started to question a lot more things, and it started to be questioning everything. You know, like why are they building the bridge this way? Why is this fire hydrant thing located here? Why is the police located here? Why, when you move places, do you do this and that? And I started to ask a lot of questions. It could be to Google, or it could be to people like my father. I thought, wow, my dad is like this giant source of information. I can just ask him a lot of questions and he'll probably know the answer to them, or he'll probably give me a really good answer. And he's like this amazing source of information that I can use. And it's free, like, and it's like, it's from your father as well. So it's like, I started to think, wow, this is some really valuable things, really valuable information that can answer all my questions. So I just started questioning a lot of things around those ages, like 17 to 19. And I'm trying to think of some examples, but just about everything that you could think of, like why you do things, or why you do things in a certain order, or why when you do this one thing do you have to do the other, why restaurants do this and that, why movie theaters do this and that, why do they charge for this, why do you park here, why everything. I started to question everything. And this sort of built up until I was around 19, 20. Right now I'm 21, right? But around the time, up until I was around 19, 20 is when it started to build up. And then when I was 19, 20 is around the time I watched Death Note for the first time. Alright, thank you for watching. Check out the next video to find out how Death Note affected me in the way I think right now. Make sure to look at the timestamps to jump right back into the action.